Hey guys, my name's Pocket and welcome back to League 101. Today we're going to be taking an in-depth look at Senna. I think Senna is really strong right now and she's actually one of my most played champions, so I think after this guide you're going to be well on your way to climbing with her. As usual, this is a 101 guide, so we're going to be going from the absolute basics all the way up to the niche tips and tricks that are really going to help you master Senna. So I'm going to put the timestamps in the video description if you want to hop around to anything specific, and we're just going to get straight into it. Now to start off, we're going to go over Senna's abilities and her passive so that you know what she can and what she can't do, and this is really just going to help your game knowledge, which is really important, especially if you're picking her up for the first time. Now first up is Senna's passive, and this is actually quite a complex passive and there's quite a lot of maths to it, so if you check out my Memberfire guide, I'll put a link in the video description, then you'll be able to see my text guide on this, which goes much more in depth. But just to start off, we're going to go over the basics of how it works and how you can get some use out of it. Firstly, Senna's basic attacks are not projectiles, and they do 120% AD damage as opposed to the 100% AD damage that a normal champion's basic attacks do. They also don't fully benefit from attack speed, and they have this attack ramp up time which scales with your level, so you're not really going to be building as much attack speed items, but we're going to go over this more in the build section. It's also important to note that Senna's basic attacks crit for 130% damage as opposed to the 200% damage that a normal champion's basic attacks crit for. Now for Senna's actual passive. This is Absolution, and it allows her to collect mist from enemy champions that she damages twice in short succession. When Senna collects a stack of mist from a champion, she deals bonus damage between 1 and 16% of the target's current health, scaling with Senna's champion level. Senna can also collect mist from mist raves. These are small, targetable items that drop on the ground when enemy or neutral units die near Senna. If Senna kills the unit, then there is a lower chance for them to drop than if somebody else kills the unit, including other units. But epic monsters like Baron, Rift Herald, and Dragon will always drop too. Also, if Senna doesn't kill a cannon minion or a super minion, then they will always drop one. Now for each stack of mist that Senna gains, she gets 0.75 attack damage. For each 20 stacks that she gains, she gets 25 attack range and 15% critical strike chance. Absolution also allows Senna to convert excess crit strike chance above 100% into lifesteal at a rate of 35%. Okay, now like I said, this seems complicated, but in practice and how you use it, it really isn't that complicated. The things that you just need to know is that Senna effectively has infinite scaling on these stacks, and that if you kill minions, that you've got a lower chance of getting a stack. We'll talk more about this passive as necessary in the other sections, but for now, we're just going to get straight into her actual abilities. Senna's Q is Piercing Darkness. Senna fires a cannon at a targetable unit within 600 or 1100 range, depending on your mist stacks. The cannon shot heals allies and damages enemies, and the healing beam is wider than the damage beam. Both beams extend up to 1300 units, which is really far, and they also apply on-hit effects to enemies. Senna's W is Last Embrace. Senna fires a projectile in a target direction, dealing damage and attaching to the first unit that it hits. After 1 second, it explodes, and the unit alongside all units that are in its radius, now this will be a little circle shown on the ground, are rooted for 1.25 to 2.25 seconds. This root duration is based on the ability level. If the unit dies before the 1 second is up, the mist explodes immediately, rooting all enemies. Senna's E is Curse of the Black Mist. Senna shrouds herself and her allies in the mist, granting them 20% movement speed, camouflaging them, and also granting them Wraith form. Wraith form turns your allies into wraiths. These wraiths have obscured vision when they leave the mist, which means that the enemy can see where they are, but they can't see who they are. They just appear as these really scary wraiths crawling across the ground. While in the mist, however, they gain camouflage, which means they can't be seen and you can't tell where they are, but they can still be hit by skill shots that are fired into the mist. This camouflage can be broken by the typical things that can break camouflage. These include, but are not limited to, being near a tower, being near a control ward, or an enemy champion managing to get into the mist, which will reveal everybody. Also, should somebody fire a skill shot into the mist and hit somebody and this skill shot reveals enemy champions, for example Corki's Q or Kaiser's W, then this will also break the camouflage. It's also important to remember here that while they can't tell where your allies are, they can always tell where you are because you're always at the center of the circle of mist, so be careful because skill shots are fairly easy to target onto you. Senna's ult is Dawning Shadow. Dawning Shadow is a global beam ult, and Senna fires 2 simultaneous beams in the target direction. One beam is extremely wide, 2,400 units, which is massive, and this shields all allies within it. It also reveals the area, so when you fire it, you'll have the whole of this wide beam revealed across the whole map. The secondary beam is much thinner. It's fired at the exact same time, but it's only 320 units wide. In game, this is denoted as a darker patch of mist in the middle of the beam. This smaller beam damages all enemies that it hits. The shield strength to your allies scales with the amount of mist that you've collected, so it gets better over time, and the damage to enemies scales with your bonus AD like a typical damaging ability. Now for Senna's runes. There was a time when Grasp of the Undying Senna was actually very popular and it became her most popular rune. However, I don't believe personally that it's viable at the moment. I think the changes to Senna's scaling with the mist and how much mist she collects have made Glacial Augment much better on Senna. The difference between Grasp of the Undying and Glacial Augment on Senna is incredibly lane focused, but obviously it then diverges into the late game as well. In lane with Glacial Augment, you're able to stack better on enemy champions because once you hit them with a Q or an auto attack, then they're slowed and you're speeded up and you're able to get in and get that second hit and get your stack better. However, with Grasp of the Undying, it's better just for poke. You do more damage when you hit them, especially because Grasp of the Undying is an on-hit effect, so your Q will actually proc it. Right now, in my personal preference, and the stats for win rates in solo queue really show this, Glacial Augment is 100% the best rune on Senna. I'm going to slide up a Grasp of the Undying rune set for Senna, but I'm not really going to talk about it too much. I'm just going to go into Glacial Augment, why it's better, what runes you should be using alongside the Glacial Augment, and we're just going to focus on that for now. So, Glacial Augment. Glacial Augment applies a 30 to 40% slow, depending on your champion level, to enemy champions when you attack them with a basic attack or an on-hit effect. This is our standard keystone on Senna support because it really helps you chase up those second hits to maximize the number of miss stacks that you're getting in lane. This allows you to scale really well into the late game, and even as a support, because you buy a lot of cheap items such as lethality items and rapid fire cannon, as we're going to go into in a bit, it really means that you do scale well as Senna. You're obviously an infinitely scaling champion effectively, so it's really good to get ahead and get some really good stacks down early on. Glacial Augment also gives us access to the inspiration tree, which as we're going to see has some really great runes. In line 1, we'll take magical footwear. This is our typical choice because free boots save you money, which is great, especially on a support, but also they give an extra 10 movement speed over boots that you would buy yourself. This movement speed increase persists into the fully built boots, so you end up with boots that are giving you 10% movement speed for the whole game. As we've talked about, being able to kite and being able to chase up for those second hits and get your stacks on Senna is really important, so this is just really awesome. On our second line, we're going to take Biscuit Delivery. Now this offers two things. Firstly, of course, it gives you mana and health regen in lane when you eat the biscuit. This can be very helpful because before you've stacked Presence of Mind, you might have mana issues on Senna, especially into very oppressive lanes where you're using Q to sustain yourself a lot, or into lanes that you're oppressing very heavily and you're using Q and auto attacks to stack really consistently. You might find yourself running a bit low on mana because you're spamming the abilities onto them, which can be really good for poke, but really bad for your mana pool. The second benefit, and an often overlooked stat for biscuits, is that each biscuit gives you 50 bonus maximum mana. Combined with Presence of Mind, this means that you really increase your late game mana pool, which is very good on Senna because you don't buy any mana rejuvenating or mana granting items, except for the support item since the changes in mid-season 10. And lastly, we're going to take Approach Velocity. This rune is pretty much mandatory on Senna and is definitely one of the best things about the inspiration tree. When you have Glacial Augment, both your Q hits and your auto attacks are going to slow the enemy down, which means that you're going to proc Approach Velocity. Also, this rune was buffed recently to allow you to gain movement speed to enemies that your allies have impaired as well, which means that you are constantly having a great movement speed buff. And as we've talked about, having a good amount of movement speed towards enemy champions is really good for chasing up those stacks and making yourself even more relevant into the late game. For our secondaries on Senna, we are always going to take the Precision Tree, and this is so that you can take Presence of Mind. This rune restores 20% of your maximum mana every time you get a kill or an assist, which is really awesome, but also it gives you 100 maximum mana bonus for each kill or assist up to 5 kills or assists. This means that you have up to 500 maximum mana increase, and this is just really, really good on Senna. The second rune that we'll take in this precision tree will depend on the matchup, usually the enemy support. If the enemy is particularly squishy, let's say they have an enchanter support and barely any tanks on their team, then you're going to want to take Alacrity. Alacrity is a scaling rune in the legend tree, and this allows you to gain up to 18% bonus attack speed. As we've talked about, Senna doesn't scale with attack speed in the same way, so she doesn't get the full benefit from this rune as other ADCs will, but it still helps and it still increases your damage. However, if the enemy is full of tanks, or if they have a particularly tanky support bot lane, then you're going to want to take Cut Down. Cut Down is a rune that allows you to do more damage to people that have more maximum health than you. This means it into particularly tanky bot lanes, maybe even champions that will build health items like Knight's Vow. You are going to want this because it increases your damage. Secondly, Cut Down got a pseudo buff on Senna recently because all other ADCs, but not Senna, got their base health and their base health scaling increased. Senna, however, did not get this buff, which means the ratio of Senna's HP to the enemy ADC's HP increases over time. Therefore, Cut Down is even better on Senna into enemy ADCs as well. So I always take this when the enemy looks particularly tanky or has a very tanky support. And lastly, we're going to take double adaptive force and a defensive choice to suit, which of course is usually going to be armor. I would advise against taking the scaling HP rune, as you want the immediate defensive stats in lane usually, and if you take Cut Down, then you definitely don't want to take the HP rune. Now for builds. We're going to start off with boots, and you should be building boots as soon as you can on Senna, but of course if you followed my rune section and you have taken magical footwear, then you're going to be limited by how long it takes for your magical footwear to come in, which is going to be 12 minutes minus 45 seconds for each takedown. The core boot choice for Senna is Boots of Swiftness. The reasons for this are very simple. They give an extra 15 more movement speed than the other standard boot choices, and Senna doesn't really scale with attack speed in the same way as other ADCs like we've talked about, so we're not really going to be looking towards attack speed boots either. They're also very cheap, which keeps your costs down, which is really good, especially on support, and they're just the overall core boot choice. Of course, as usual, if the enemy is full AP or full AD, then you can look towards Ninja Tabby or Mercury's Treads as a defensive option. Now we're going to talk about the early items on Senna and where your power spikes are and how you should be trying to go about your build paths. To start off, we're going to talk about Serrated Dirk. This is a huge early power spike, and it's the first item that you're really going to be working towards. It offers a massive 30 AD and 10 lethality for just 1100 gold. So when you compare that to 1300 gold for a BF sword, which gives you 40 AD, this is just massively gold efficient. In pretty much every game, this is the first item that I'm going for. Even if I don't have enough for it, I'll be taking 2 long swords and waiting until I can build it. It's just such a great early power spike that you don't want to delay it. The second early item that we're going to talk about, and this is one of the best things about Senna on support, is you can build Executioner's Calling. While not a very high damage item, it gives you grievous wounds for only 800 gold really early on, and you have a very consistent way of proccing it because of your great range and poke. Executioner's Calling is a fantastic item on Senna, and I build it in almost every game nowadays. Even when they don't have an enchanter support, I'm going to pick it up at some point because healing has just become so overwhelming in League at the moment. However, I do want to talk about Executioner's Calling and Serrated Dirk together, and the fact that you should probably build Serrated Dirk before Executioner's Calling, even into high healing bot lanes. I've tested this at length, and we've talked about it on stream quite a lot as well with other Senna players, and we just feel that Serrated Dirk and the massive damage power spike that it gives is even better than cutting their healing down early on. Into oppressive healing like a Soraka or a Yuumi, then I'm probably going to build Executioner's Calling before I finish that Dirk into an Umbral Glaive, but I still want to get that Serrated Dirk before the Executioner's Calling. That's because even on these really oppressive healing enchanters, you still don't have that much healing coming out of them really early on. So even though it's great to get grievous wounds and cut their healing by 40%, which is pretty big, the extra damage of Dirk just can't be ignored. If they don't have this oppressive healing though, then you're going to want to delay Executioner's Calling, potentially forever, and just pick it up at some point when you feel like anti-heals is what your team needs. Now for the core items on Senna. The first item that you're going to be picking up every single game on Senna as support is Umbral Glaive. In my opinion, this item is ridiculously good right now. It has a great build path, it's stupidly cheap, and it gives you an amazing amount of vision control. If you don't know how this item works, basically when you are spotted by a ward or an invisible trap such as a Jhin or a Teemo Mushroom, it activates, and then for 8 seconds all traps and wards around you are revealed, and then you also do triple damage to them. What's particularly amazing about this is that the triple damage to wards actually persists even when it's not activated, and that means that on a ranged champion like Senna, especially with Senna's huge range, if they place a ward down near you and you have Umbral Glaive, one auto attack and it's dead straight away. You don't even need to reveal it. Also, because your Q applies on hit effects, it also gains this. So if you Q a ward or a trap, you'll do triple damage. Also, for traps like Shaco boxes that don't have this 1 unit health like wards do, you will instantly kill them if you disable them, no matter what their HP is. Our second core item is Duskblade of Drakfar. Once again, I will build this every game straight after Umbral Glaive, and it's just a fantastic item. Its stats are almost pure damage with even some cooldown reduction as well. It has a passive that does extra damage when you've been unseen for a while, so this synergizes super well with your E. Overall, it's just a really good damage item. It's relatively cheap at just 2,900 gold, and it keeps you super relevant as a damage dealing support. Our next core item, and once again this is pretty much always the third item that I build, is Rapid Fire Cannon. Once you've built your lethality items, you're probably going to be pretty far into the game. This item is really cheap, and it has a great passive. Its passive allows you to build up stacks as you move around, and then at 100 stacks you'll have an empowered auto attack, which will give you an extra 150 range and on-hit magic damage. This is really great, especially on Senna, as you can have this huge range to get your first auto attack, which will slow them, speed you up, and allow you to get that second hit in for these good trades that are also pretty safe. It's very cheap, and it also gives you 25% crit chance. Now, once you've built all of your lethality items, you're probably getting quite late into the game, and you probably, or at least hopefully, have a lot of missed stacks. This means that quite often Rapid Fire Cannon is pushing me up to that 100% crit chance area, which is really good. And then if you've got beyond that, then this actually gives you a little bit of lifesteal, which is also really awesome. And our final core item is Mortal Reminder. Now this can be replaced with Lord Dominic's Regards if the enemy really don't have any healing, but as a support I want the utility. There's pretty much no enemy team comps anymore that will come at you and have absolutely no healing, so because my damage isn't the most important thing in the world, that extra utility of having Grievous Wounds on your team into the late game is something that I very rarely want to forgo, so Mortal Reminder is pretty much always my pick here. Obviously it builds off Executioner's Calling, which is really good. It's not too expensive at just 2,800 gold, and it gives you a huge amount of percentage armor penetration. This means that as the enemy have started to buy armor or really just get armor as they scale with level, it makes it even more important in the late game than it would have been earlier on. Because of this, it's usually my last core item to build. Now, those of you who have been paying close attention probably already realize this, but these core items plus boots and support item mean that you don't have any item slots left. This means that the situational item slots for Senna is pretty limited. Our first situational item is Guardian Angel. It's a pretty rare item to build on Senna, but it's very good into full AD enemies, especially if that full AD team has an AD assassin. It gives you damage, it gives you armor, it has a fairly good build path with BF Sword in there, and its passive allows you to come back to life, which is really good into assassins because hopefully they'll have used all of their burst killing you, and then you come back to life. They don't have any burst left, which means they have to either leave or you're going to have the upper hand in a trade. If you are in Champ Select and you see that the enemy has a full AD team and they have a big assassin or maybe even a couple of AD assassins, then you should probably choose the Stopwatch rune rather than Magical Footwear. The reason for this is that although Stopwatch only saves you 250 gold, whereas boots save you 300, it's actually kind of nice to get those boots earlier on as Senna, and having that Stopwatch to actually use in lane an extra time is really good. I would suggest only doing this when you know that you are definitely going to build Guardian Angel though. And our second and final situational item is Yumu's Ghostblade. Now I used to build this a whole lot on Senna, but now it's pretty much limited to times when I'm in game and I would have been going along my normal build path, but our bot lane has gone particularly badly, and in solo queue maybe you just have a pretty bad ADC and you want to roam a lot. Yumu's Ghostblade gives you a good amount of stats. It's not quite as high damage as Duskblade of Drakfar, but the damage stats are still pretty high, and it also gives you 40 out of combat movement speed, which allows you to roam really nicely, and then alongside this it has an active which yet again gives you more movement speed. This active gives you 20% more movement speed and allows you to ghost through units. The other situation in which I'll build Yumu's is incredibly niche, but you should be aware of it, and that is when the enemy has an insignificant amount of healing and nobody on their team is building any armor. If they don't have healing, then you don't need Executioner's Calling, so you don't need Mortal Reminder, and if they also aren't building any armor, then Yumu's is actually more damage against squishies with no extra armor built than building that last Whisper percentage armor penetration item. And we're going to finish off with a couple of little tips and tricks that are really going to get you on your way to mastering Senna. Firstly, don't build Infinity Edge. As we've talked about, Senna doesn't do the full 200% crit damage of a normal champion, so Infinity Edge only buffs her crit strike damage by 16.25%, not 25%. This means that in the vast majority of games, your armor penetration item will be the higher damage output item. When you combine that with the fact that you can buy the anti-heal item for utility, especially in the role of support, you should pretty much never build IE. It's extremely expensive and it just doesn't quite cut it on Senna. A Reddit user called U_Disciple actually has a really good explanation of this on Reddit, which I'm going to link in the video description if you want to get really deep into the maps, but we're just going to move on. Number 2, don't forget to pick up all your souls after a fight. This seems a little obvious, but it's something that newer Senna players really have to get used to. They might be off screen, so just have a look around for them. They'll show up even if they're in a bush that you don't have vision in, so just make sure that you're picking them up after a fight and maximizing your stacks. Number 3, take Barrier. I was always skeptical about the Barrier pick myself. I thought Ignite or Exhaust would be better on bot lane. However, after a lot of testing and a lot of discussion with other Senna mains, I really do think that Barrier is 100% the best summoner spell choice for Senna in the support role. You're really squishy, and especially since you didn't get part of the HP buffs to ADCs, you're comparably even more squishy than you used to be. Obviously, this means that Barrier's survivability is really good, but also because you're a very high damage support, that extra survivability allows you to survive longer, and even if you do end up dying, the amount of damage that you can output is really significant during the Barrier. And lastly, as Barrier applies to yourself, not to the enemy, you don't actually have to get into range to use Ignite or Exhaust. Often as Senna, if you're capable of using Ignite or Exhaust on the enemy ADC, you're out of position, which means things have already gone badly and it's probably going to be used in a pretty poor way. If things have already gone badly, then Barrier is probably the best bet. It gives you the most survivability and, like we said, allows you to put out the most damage before you die or before they manage to kill you. And lastly, use the massive range on your Q combined with the triple damage of your Umbral Glaive to kill wards without actually having to go over walls and put yourself out of position. This is something very unique to Senna, but the triple damage of Umbral Glaive allows you to one-shot stealth wards and farsight alterations, whilst also doing 3 out of 4 ticks of damage to a control ward. This means that you can often clear vision over a wall, let's say into Baron or Dragon Pit, without having to take the pretty risky trip around the wall and into the pit itself like you would have to do on a different support. And we're done. Thank you very much for watching. I really hope this has been helpful. If you've got any questions or you want to ask me anything, then leave a comment or come and catch me live on stream, and I'm sure I'm going to be able to help you out. And as usual, if you want to keep up with this League 101 series, then make sure you subscribe.